Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me. We'll just wait just a few minutes. Lots to cover today. If you have a question, go ahead and add it to the comments, and hopefully I can get to it before the end of the day. One second. See if that's better. Just be a moment. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. I'm Sunnyvale Mayor Larry Klein, and welcome to our 6th installment of my weekly virtual office hours. People continue to say that they really appreciate these weekly updates. It gives them a chance to ask questions, find out what's really happened over the last week without, watching all the news, and just find out what's happening in the community, how they can get more involved. So thank you for allowing me to represent you and work for you. It's been a lot of effort over the last 5-6 weeks, but I hope that I'm representing you well, and I'm hoping that I'm helping give people a way to get through this very stressful time. So people throughout the Sunnyvale and the Bay Area have been real heroes. It's our supermarket personnel, it's our delivery people, it's our healthcare workers, city staff, all the people that are on the essential front lines. And whatever I can do to either herald what they're doing or get them the resources they need. That's one of the best things about being mayor right now. These are extraordinary and difficult times, and I hope that everyone that's watching, everyone who sees this is doing well, staying healthy. And this Facebook Live event allows me to just answer some of your questions, but also give you some words of encouragement as you're going through your week. Remember, utmost, take care of yourself, both physically and mentally. Go outside of your house, go into your backyard. The weather is beautiful right now. Sheltering in place has helped. Definitely we are seeing the curve level out. That being said, we still have a ways to go as far as getting to the end of this. Keep the county health orders in mind, and we'll go through some changes that they made last week. You can do your part to help spread, the virus. Continue to wash your hands. Don't touch your face. Maintain social distancing when you're out, and only go out for essential items. Exercising, taking a walk around the block is still allowed, but if you're out, have a mask with you. Make sure that you're staying more than 6 feet away from other people. But wearing your mask, it really does help. And we have seen the difference. We have seen, lots of good news, good data. That being said, some of the data from a statewide and, a nationwide basis is, very difficult. And we're not out of the woods yet, but, and the big thing is you can be a carrier of the virus without showing symptoms. So being asymptomatic or having other people out in the community that are asymptomatic only makes it that more important that you wear your mask. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started. People want to hear what's going on. We're now 38 days, just over a month, 38 days since the March 16th county health order went into place about sheltering in place. So that's been a big change in everyone's lives. There's been lots happening. A lot happens on a weekly basis, on a daily basis. And, part of my biggest job right now is trying to stay up to date on what's happening federally, state, county. I have multiple press conferences, Governor Newsom's daily noontime press conference to watch, as well as, conference calls at a federal level with the CDC, with the mayors, with the National League of Mayors, with, at a state level, at a county level, elected calls. It's very, very busy, but, I think trying to stay up to date, trying to figure out what other cities are doing and what's happening around our state and around our nation is really important. And I'm not a news junkie. I'm rarely actually watching the news other than checking the weather on a daily basis, but it's important to stay up to date. And part of what I'll do later is kind of go through what's happened over the last week. First off, however, I've had multiple people ask, what has City Council done in the last 6 weeks or so? So I'll start off with that update. Some people have heard this. People that have been watching this on a weekly basis have seen, my updates and kind of giving a short summary. But let's kind of start this off with an overview of what we've done, what Council's done over the last 6 weeks. So first on March 12th, the city manager, Kent Steffens, declared a local state of emergency. So this was kind of a first step of starting off our emergency operations center, evaluating staff, evaluating operations throughout the city. It also kind of puts a stake in the ground when, FEMA funding and, businesses that ask for resources. This basically said we declared our state of emergency on a specific date. City Council then met on March 17th, and then we adopted, we did several things, but the first thing that we did was adopt a resolution ratifying that state of emergency locally. And that's for every 60 days. So within, that's a 60-day declaration. So every certain period of time within that 60 days, we need to redeclare it for another 60 days. We can end it early, but we just don't, we redeclare that from a local Sunnyvale standpoint. It's part of our plan to do that every 60 days until we terminate basically the COVID-19 emergency. But, what we're now doing is from starting staffing that EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, we're also coordinating with our partners. We're seeking, mutual aid. We're evaluating all of our resources. And, last week, all of the people in the county, all the big companies that had large amounts of PPE, whether or not it's face masks, ventilators, glasses, they were supposed to report that to the county. So the county has a county-wide inventory depending upon whether or not there's an increased need. But we did that from a city standpoint right away. And that's important, looking at staffing, looking at vacations, looking at all that to make sure that we're, as good as we can be to manage the emergency. The other thing that we did from a council standpoint on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, was to authorize the city manager to negotiate and execute emergency assistance with Sunnyvale Community Services, and that was in the amount of $250,000. So that was for them to operate and also, more importantly, to provide financial support, whether or not that's rent, utilities, whatever, for families that have been hit by COVID-19. So that was one of our first steps to make sure that Sunnyvale Community Services, which is our main, service agency that supports Sunnyvale, had the money that they needed to provide resources to residents that were in need. And their efforts have increased greatly over the last month as far as being able to provide food to 1,000 families a day. They've been doing grocery bags of weekly food to families in need. It's really important. They've also been helping out with the managing of food to seniors, and also the school districts have been distributing food, and that's also been coming through the help of Sunnyvale Community Services. And the other thing that we did in that first meeting was we authorized the city manager to suspend interruption of water service for 60 days. So that was kind of a first step, that nobody's water will get turned off while they're having to shelter in place. 2 weeks later, on the Tuesday evening of March 31st, no, that's not right. On March 31st, we had our special meeting, and that was to basically put in place an eviction moratorium. So the eviction moratorium was for two things ultimately. It clarified, and in that 2-week period since our first meeting, the county had put in eviction moratoriums for both business and residential that lasted until May 31st. The big change for our local eviction moratorium was we added mobile homes. So mobile homes weren't really well defined in the county order. And the other thing was, as opposed to the payback period, we made it so the county's order was 120 days after May 31st, residents and business owners would have time to pay back without fees, without late fees, whatever rent was due during that period up to May 31st. They had 120 days to pay that back to the landlord. We changed it slightly from a Sunnyvale standpoint. What we did from a Sunnyvale standpoint was make it 180 days for residential, and only applying to residential, to after the termination of the state of emergency. So it's basically a 6-month period after the end of the state of emergency that people will have a chance to pay back the rent to their landlord. So it's a slightly different change. The county order applied to all the cities, so our business owners have the same protection from a county level, but we added additional restrictions from the city level. because we thought that that was important to protect our residents and also give them more of a time that, assuming that the emergency is terminated, getting a job, being able to pay back that rent to those landlords over a longer period of time. And even though we've done that, we continue to hear, I continue to hear from residents whose landlords are threatening them with eviction or, late fees and all that. Sunnyvale has put together several flyers, so, you can, take a look on the website. I pasted it on my Facebook page. If you have issues with your landlord, definitely feel free to reach out to the City of Sunnyvale, so contact the City of Sunnyvale, or contact Project Sentinel. So Project Sentinel is a local nonprofit, and what they do is do landlord tenant mediation. And during this time, a lot of those issues are related to evictions and COVID-19. So if you want to contact Project Sentinel, you can go to their website, housing.org, or you can do the Sunnyvale Mediation Program number, so specifically for Sunnyvale, 408-470-3744. So, and then after our special meeting to deal with eviction moratorium, Council met on April 7th, so 1 week later, and we did a few things at that meeting. One thing, we extended the city's declaration for the local emergency for another 60 days. So we'll be doing that intermittently as we get closer to whenever the county and the state really thinks that there needs to be a termination of that local emergency. And then we also dealt with the utilities. So council approved no rate increases for water and garbage. And so that was important. And we also adopted, a resolution for the city manager to suspend late charges and delinquency processing for water, sewer, and garbage. And we also extended that suspension of the interruption of water service until June 30th. So we did a lot of things around the utilities at that point. There still will be a 4% increase in our sewage rates starting July 1st. It's important. We're currently doing a full rebuild of the wastewater treatment plant in Sunnyvale. So it's important that we have that revenue stream that's making sure that several decade or more than a decade rebuild of that wastewater treatment plant that was built in the 50s. It's important that goes forward, and that's funding that to make sure that we have the appropriate facilities that our city needs, and more active, more able to process more, and actually able to produce conceivably clean drinking water at the end of the day, not just recycled water. And so the water and garbage rates will be managed from our fiscal reserves over the next year, and we'll evaluate that depending upon, in 6 months, but conceivably there will be no rate increases for that. From a valley water standpoint, valley water, so Sunnyvale gets its water from two different sources. The SFPUC and Valley Water are the main two sources that we get it from. And Valley Water is still talking about a 6 to 8% increase. So I've been advocating with the Valley Water board members to postpone that increase. I just wrote a letter yesterday. There's a meeting Tuesday night to talk about the increase in rates. So I signed that letter yesterday. Hopefully Valley Water will do the same thing that we've done. Otherwise, that increase is completely on the burdened by the city itself and from our fiscal reserves. And then the last council meeting, Tuesday, April 14th, we met remotely, and so we've been meeting remotely. This was the third time we met remotely, and so we can meet remotely because Governor Newsom signed basically put some executive orders in around the Brown Act that there doesn't need to be a physical location for meetings. We now are able to take both both voicemail comments from residents as well as written comments during the meeting that will be read out by the city clerk. So people can immediately give feedback to council during the items that we're looking at. And you can take a look at our meeting notices if you want to give feedback on any agenda item. And we had one major item at the last meeting, and that was the creation of a small business assistance program. So related to COVID-19, our businesses have been also very hardly hit, and the funding and the support from a federal level has not really come through as much as we would have liked. So council approved $600,000 as a matching amount to high-tech companies that want to support local businesses. And a lot of high-tech companies have been purchasing meals and giving them out to either volunteers or to health or to the shelters. So they've been actually really helping out. But we've had our first two companies step up, which was Google for $300,000 and LinkedIn for $100,000. And so council authorized $600,000 matching, meaning that's now an $800,000 pool with the $400 and the $400 for business loans to Sunnyvale brick and mortar establishments of up to $15,000. Now, all the details for this program haven't been finalized yet. We authorized city staff to work with the Enterprise Foundation. So the Enterprise Foundation we've been working with for about 15 years has, it's a Bay Area nonprofit that works with small businesses on their marketing plan, on getting SBA loans. So they've been active already with the city and within the city. And so they will be administering as well as working with city staff on defining that criteria. We're guessing that sometime early May, so only about a week away, that program will go live and go online. And so then, then different businesses can be applying for that. And I'm also, so the other thing that we did that meeting was we authorized the city manager. We authorized $150,000 in grants for staff to basically go to nonprofit agencies that are servicing Sunnyvale residents and businesses related to the COVID-19 emergency. So we had previously given $250,000 directly to Sunnyvale Community Services, but there's multiple nonprofits within the city that also help businesses and residents. So Meals on Wheels and some of those other nonprofits that directly help our residents. That's one of the things that funding will go to. So that's a quick overview of what council has done in the last month. And the staffing at the city level has changed. We closed all the city facilities. We reapportioned city staff to actually help Sunnyvale Community Services on a daily basis, whether or not that's delivering food or doing other things. And beyond that, it's basically helping them pick up medication, pick up groceries, deliver senior meals. That's what city staff has been doing. So let's talk about, that's what's happened at a council level over the last month. Let's talk about what's happened over the last week. So most important, the county updated their directions regarding face coverings. And as much as I had hoped that it had been mandated, it's basically, the county is strongly urging the community to wear face coverings. And it's not specifically, it's not your N95 mask, because those are still needed for healthcare personnel. But it's cloth masks, it's bandanas, it's those, it's important that, the direction from the county was, mix face coverings with social distancing. So wearing that face covering combined with, social distancing is really important, and combined with the hand washing, all of those are important. And, they should be worn when waiting in line to enter essential businesses like grocery stores, when seeking health care, when waiting to ride transit, and when on transit, when entering any facilities that basically aren't your home. So it's strongly encouraged to cover your mouth and nose with a face covering, bandana, a scarf, a towel, any piece of cloth or fabric when leaving your home, and going to doctor's appointments, pharmacy visits, all of that. When is face covering not needed? When you're at home, when you're in the car alone or with family members of your household, when you're exercising outdoors, walking, biking, running. But it's always good to have a face mask with you just in case, you do have to socially distance. And you should not be wearing a face. So who shouldn't be wearing a face mask? Children 6 years and under, anyone who has trouble breathing, so is or incapacitated, or anybody who's been advised by a medical professional not to wear a face covering. And it's important from a habit standpoint that, as soon as you get back home, you're washing your hands. You're also washing your face mask. You're also, putting it under warm water, hot water, and then letting it dry, because conceivably you've touched things while you're out and then you've touched your face mask. It's important that it stay dry, that you're not wearing it for hours and hours, or you're changing out your face masks. So that's what the county did last Friday. And we'll talk a little bit more about mandating a little later. Last Friday, Governor Newsom also released the California's roadmap to modify the stay-at-home order. So, this is basically defining what the requirements are to make sure that we can actually lift the state of emergency within our state, within the county, within the city. And there were basically 6 indicators that the governor laid out for modifying that stay-at-home order. One of which was, and I think, one of the most important, ability to monitor and protect our communities through testing, contact tracing, isolating, and supporting those who are positive or exposed. So, and I think the critical thing there is getting appropriate testing. We have the ability to isolate. Right now we have the capacity in our hospitals, but to me it's getting adequate testing within our county, within our city, throughout California. Number 2 is the ability to prevent infection in people who are at risk for more severe COVID-19. So whether or not we will have some sort of vaccine soon is important. The ability of a hospital and healthcare system to handle surges. So that's being monitored, very closely. We've looked at the Santa Clara Convention Center as overflow. So we've basically been administering that to make sure that we have appropriate level of response ready. Number 4, the ability to develop therapeutics to meet the demand. Number 5, the ability of businesses, schools, and childcare facilities to support physical distancing. So until that happens, you've already seen it in restaurants, but until we can do the same thing for schools and childcare facilities, those won't be opening. And the ability to determine when to reinstate certain measures, such as stay-at-home orders, so if necessary. So, being able to monitor this closely and figuring out, is there a ratcheting up and a ratcheting down of those stay-at-home orders, depending upon what's happening in our society. So that was what Governor Newsom laid out last Friday. Definitely, there's been ongoing questions about, are we ready to open? From my standpoint, we're following a lot of the directives of what Dr. Cody has done from a county level. A lot of people are starting to write to us, to City Council, asking, can we hurry up and open? Until the county sees it as safe, I don't see I don't see an immediate opening up. I see at some point we will, increase the number of people that can meet, but what facilities will be able to be opened, that'll take a while. Several things, last weekend also, Bloomberg announced that California faces a budget shortfall that could top $35 billion. And so we had planned for about a $7 billion surplus this fiscal year. Now it's looking like it might be as much as $35 billion deficit with all the money spent, with the lack of income coming in. So, this is an ongoing issue. Definitely we're looking right now from a city standpoint, we're evaluating our budget. May is always budget month, and we have a big meeting in May to talk about our city budget, and then define approve our budget in June to start for our July 1st budget for our budget year or fiscal year. But there's a lot of question from a city standpoint, and more importantly from a state standpoint, about funding. And so there's been a lot of programs that the governor's talked about, and whether or not and where all that money comes from is really important. So on Tuesday, and I don't think this got as much news as people as I thought it would get, but it is kind of interesting what is the top thing in the news at any given time. I'm sure that people have heard, people watch kind of what the latest hot news topic is, or the misspeak of let's say a certain Las Vegas mayor that's been around the talked about quite a bit over the last day or so. But on Tuesday, the county supervisors voted to waive penalties on property tax payments. So, this was something that I'd been advocating with our county supervisors before the April 10th deadline. It didn't get approved then, and part of the reason is because, how our county pays the state, basically the county prepays the state whether or not everybody pays their property taxes. And so they didn't, they basically said that everybody still had to pay on April 10th. That being said, now all the details haven't been finalized, so they'll be put out more, sometime in the next week or two. But the Board of Supervisors voted to waive the 10% penalty. So if you didn't pay, normally you would have a 10% penalty and a $20 fee on property tax payments that were due on April 10th, but paid late. So this will be publicized more, what the payment options that are available, but it's basically everyone who could pay on April 10th and paid were able to pay, and that was important from a county standpoint. Anyone who wasn't able to pay because they were hit by COVID-19 and were willing to pay those penalties, they ultimately won't have to waive those penalties, and they're looking for what the payback program is going to be for those property taxes. But definitely, if you didn't pay, you have more time and you're not being penalized by the county. So that didn't get that much press this week, but I think it's really important for those that were really hit and had to choose between food and utilities versus what was being done at the county level, paying your property taxes. On Wednesday, the county health department declared that we had 3 deaths in Santa Clara County long before we previously thought. So what Dr. Cody announced on Wednesday was the 3 deaths were questionable at the beginning of February, beginning of March, or in February and March, and we thought might have been related to COVID-19. That being said, we didn't have appropriate tests at that point to figure out whether that was the case. So samples were taken, they were sent to the CDC, and ultimately, after a certain period of time, the results came back. So one person died on February 6th, one person died on February 17th, and a third died on March 6th, and all of them were COVID-19 related. So to me, it's a realization that it affected our community earlier. That being said, it doesn't really affect. I don't think it's that critical. What's more important is what's currently happening and how ultimately how we come out of the COVID-19. How we loosen the shelter in place, how we bring our businesses and restart our businesses within our cities. That's far more important. So it doesn't fundamentally change our thinking, or at least my thinking, about what the virus is and how it's affecting what measures we need to take. But it's important kind of from a timeline standpoint. That's the only thing is we know that we had early cases, and these were people that had not traveled internationally. So this was contact from, this was incidental contact from somebody who had traveled internationally that had been affected here. So that's the kind of the only interesting thing out of all this in my mind. On Wednesday, Governor Newsom announced that that as far as the statewide shelter-in-place order, it will now allow resuming certain medical procedures and preventative care. So if there were heart valve replacements, angioplasties, tumor removals, preventative care like colonoscopies, those can now be allowed in hospitals again. Looking at what our hospital the rates of people that are being hospitalized because of COVID-19, it's important to figure out, what the capacity is and whether or not these procedures can start again. And so that'll still be defined at a county level and basically in a hospital by hospital level, but it is now seen as, okay, we can resume those options, as opposed to only emergencies or COVID-19 related items as how the hospitals were for the last month or so. And kind of in retrospect, on Thursday, California endured our deadliest day yet. So, Governor Newsom reported that we had 115 deaths due to COVID-19. Yesterday he did this over the previous 24 hours. So that was a peak from the number of deaths that we had. So it was 8.5% increase compared to the day before. But that being said, we've also seen a decrease in intensive care needed. So the number of people going into the hospital because of COVID-19. So that's actually dropped, and the county has their dashboard, and I've posted about that several times. People can see the actual data, and it's updated on a daily basis. Our numbers are increasing, but it's kind of leveled out. So right now, so far, San Jose has had 1,324 cases. Sunnyvale has had 109. Santa Clara 96. Other cities, Palo Alto 67. So there's a mixture of cases within the county, and those numbers are updated on a daily basis. And just this morning, breaking news from a nationwide standpoint, at least 50,000 people have died because of the U.S. from coronavirus. So now we've reached, the number of 50,031, I think, is the reported deaths from COVID-19. And that's according to Johns Hopkins. And then they also said that there are approximately 870,000 cases within the U.S. So that's the latest news. It's like we had our worst day yet from a California standpoint. That being said, the number of cases, the number of new cases, the number of people being hospitalized is kind of leveling off, or conceivably, depending upon where you are, what county, what city, is kind of tending down in a few places in the state. But we need to continue to monitor that, and people still need to do the safe social distancing, wearing the mask, all that, in order to make sure that spread, is lessened as much as possible. Okay, so that's kind of a quick summary of what happened over the last week. Let's go through new questions. And some of these are old questions that I get every few weeks, so I'll cover them again. First, my neighbors would like to know if the farmers market is still open on Saturdays. Are there vendor stalls remain in the same place? Is there more space? Is there room for shoppers to do appropriate physical distancing? So yes, the farmers market is still open. I go almost every week. But Urban Village, which manages this market and multiple markets in the South Bay here. They've been doing a lot of efforts to make sure that there's appropriate spacing. And when you start looking at that, they've added senior hours from 8 to 9, from 9 to 10 a.m. They request that people wear a mask. They have marked out on the street about queuing at different stalls that are different sellers. It's more now it's a you touch it, you buy it sort of thing, that either you can't physically touch the items that the farmers are selling, or you actually have to point and they will pick it up and bag it for you and give it to you. So they put a lot of measures in place. From a safe social distancing standpoint, I find it a lot safer than being at Safeway or Target. I was at Target last weekend, and half the people in the store weren't wearing masks. So it's important that that's I feel that it's definitely a lot safer when you're at the farmers market, and it shouldn't be there for socializing. It's there for people to go buy their essential food and then move on. Next up, I live in one of the large company-owned apartment complexes, and these large companies price gouge tenants into larger rent increases when leases come due. With this being an uncertain time in many companies having layoffs, is there a way that Sunnyvale will be looking at rent increase freezes as other Bay Area cities are? So currently we're not looking at rent freeze. One of the big things was we put in place the order to make sure that you have more time to pay back your rent. And from a state standpoint, there's already a limitation on how much rents can go up. So that's an important thing that happened from a state level last year. So in January, and this became, council backdated it a little bit, but it officially came into place on January 1st, 2020, that AB 1482 was signed into law. And that capped rent increases statewide for 5% plus the regional CPI, or 10% of the lowest rent charged at any time during the last 12 months, whichever is less. So there's already a certain amount of rent protection in place. They can't, I used to hear about people going, 10%, 15% rent increases. That can't happen anymore. And so, right now, I haven't heard of people, whose rents are being increased by dramatic levels during this time. But, the landlords do have that capability. But from a statewide standpoint, there are restrictions to cap how big those rent increases can be. Next question. I'm a senior citizen living mostly on my Social Security. What I'm wondering is if the city can help senior citizens with their utility bills. Is there any way you can consider giving us discounts? My bill is well over $200. I know it's every month, but it is still a big bite in my budget for me. So, I get this question not just during now, but probably, every 6 months or so. Sunnyvale does have a low-income assistance program, but not specifically for seniors. So this is for low-income, residents, and this program is administered by SCS. So people can either call the city at 408-730-7400 to find out more about the utility assistance program, or they can contact Sunnyvale Community Services. They do a lot of the administration for this, and they can contact SCS at 408-738-4321. So that's what the city's been doing, and the city's been doing that for years. People who pay extra into their utilities, some of the high-tech companies pay into this program, so that anybody who has issues paying their rent or paying their utilities, that goes into a specific fund, and then SCS administers that and gives it to residents that need help, assistance in paying their utilities. Beyond that, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, which as opposed to PG&E, a lot of people opted in and were opted in to SVCE, committed $10 million to provide relief for customers and within our community for those that were hit by COVID-19. So this is financial support for low-income customers, and that program was approved 2 weeks ago, and so SVCE is rolling that out. PG&E and SVCE customers are already basically may be eligible for reduced energy rates through the CARE or FERA programs, but if you want more information about those programs, definitely reach out. But the city is doing something, and Silicon Valley Clean Energy is also adding additional funds and resources into that. One of the questions I got: can you explain, what is the essential work near target under the current guidelines? So the county basically said, most construction, initially was more open, that all residential could happen, and commercial construction had to stop. And then it became, 3 weeks ago, the county order changed so that only residential construction that had affordable housing, more than 10% affordable housing, could continue. The city line development at Iowa and TAFE, that currently has 12.5% for low-income apartments. So the new apartments that are being built, 12.5% will be for low-income residents. And because of that, that construction can continue. And so you can see that that's been moving fairly fast, as far as, I think they're on the 3rd story right now, as far as that building is concerned. I've gotten this question from multiple people: can we reopen nurseries and garden centers sooner than later? Not sure if they have been a cause of the spread, but was given the benefit of the doubt of that decision. Hate to lose our small nurseries. We already lost Osh. So, I checked with the county on this. The order errs on the side of advocating for those staying at home. So, and with that in mind, plant nurseries were deemed as non-essential services. So larger stores, Home Depot, Lowe's, are allowed to stay in business because they provide essential materials that help maintain habitation of one's home. So that's, in case there's plumbing, electrical issues, whatever the case is within your home, you can go to those stores and, get support. In talking to the county, they state that plant nurseries still can operate, though, but they need to provide for delivery of existing inventory to residences or businesses. So they can operate. The big thing is they have to do deliveries, and the decision about whether or not they're going to do that is basically on the individual plant nursery's owner. So it is still allowed, and some of them are doing deliveries. I was looking online, and definitely they are doing deliveries, some of the smaller ones. But contact your local nursery directly. I know we planted a garden, our victory garden, about a week and a half ago, and we're still waiting for a certain number of plants to fill those out. We sowed some seeds. We've had some seedlings that we already had going. Next question, and I've gotten this from multiple people in different ways. A lot of people have asked, why aren't face coverings required by Santa Clara County? Milpitas just required it. Santa Clara, for some reason, refused to do so. When are we passing such an ordinance in Sunnyvale? So this has been ongoing. I've been, have continued discussions with the county to mandate the wearing of some sort of face coverings. And, I've gotten different responses from them. I brought it up on county elected calls. I've been emailing with our liaison from a county level. I've talked to our county supervisors. Right now, they increased the mandate, or they increased the order to strongly urge last Friday. But, I keep pushing them, and we'll see if things change from a county level. One of the things that they keep bringing up is law enforcement, that if we mandate it from a county order, then the local law enforcement is charged with enforcing those orders. So that's a big deal. That means that you see one person walk into Safeway without a mask, somebody calls the police have to go and investigate. Now, whether or not, they probably wouldn't cite them, but that being said, the police, that the level of effort then required by the police becomes a lot more. And so the public health department is mindful of the enforcement resources. That being said, what they're trying to do is make sure that as much as possible, the people try to get into the best habit. I've argued with them, several of the county folk, that unless you mandate it, people won't change their habits. Right now I'd say probably 60%, 70% of the people wear face coverings when they're out. There's a 30% that don't, and don't have access or just don't want to. I see it much like wearing seat belts. Until we actually mandated it from wearing seat belts, a lot of people never wore seat belts. So from going back to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, the Governor Stevens at that point called it everyone's patriotic duty to wear a mask, and that pandemic killed roughly 700,000 Americans. And at that point, San Francisco actually made it a law that anyone caught in public not wearing a gauze mask or wearing it improperly was charged with disturbing the peace and fined $5. So I've been pushing the county to change their orders. I've talked it over with the city attorney and the city manager several times. There's a question about whether or not we can compose, the way our ordinances are and charters written, whether or not we could impose that. It's basically, we're not in charge of the health level, and this is a question. It's like whether or not we could actually define that order. I know some cities have, but it depends on the city. But right now there's a question about whether or not we could and should do that. So I'm trying to get it changed from a county level. 5 of the 9 counties in the Bay Area have all imposed that. A few cities have, and so hopefully we can get this changed. I think it's setting that appropriate habit and getting people into that habit is part of this. So that's important. I read in the Mercury News that San Francisco, San Jose, and Oakland have suspended parking enforcement due to coronavirus. And as such, I am reaching out to you to clarify if the parking enforcement in the city of Sunnyvale is suspended during the shelter-in-place days due to coronavirus. And so I've talked to the chief on this multiple times. The issue has been addressed at the patrol level. So as opposed to changing it and then having to change it back, officers will make an attempt to contact the registered owner of the vehicle to avoid having it being cited or towed during COVID-19. And as always, our enforcement is always complaint only. So as much as people say, oh, our police officers are driving around and randomly, ticketing cars and towing cars, it's only done, unless it's blocking an intersection or parked in front of, a fire hydrant. If a car has been there for an extended period of time, the patrol officers in front of someone's home, patrol officers aren't going to mark that car and put up a sign that says it needs to be moved in 72 hours. That's only done if somebody complains in the neighborhood. So that's an important part of this. It's not done willy-nilly. It's not done, we're not monitoring every car on the street. Although I've had a resident or two ask me, it's like, it's the police officer's responsibility to monitor, every car and have it towed 72 hours later. There's no way that could be monitored. That would be such a heavy weight on our patrol officers to mark every car and make sure that they're being moved every three days. It's impossible. It's all done when somebody calls it in, unless it's causing an immediate issue, blocking a driveway, blocking an intersection, blocking a fire hydrant. So that's the only time when it's seen as critical. Another question I got is, when would the downtown Whole Foods open, given the current state of the situation? And I, more than anybody, would like the downtown to be moving forward. That being said, we talked about the county order. The county has basically said no construction can go on unless it's affordable housing or essential services. And last week we talked about, the essential construction projects in the city. Some move forward, like the Fair Oaks Bridge work. Some didn't, like the Washington Park swim center. So it depends on, what the importance as far as essential operation is of the city. Whole Foods was probably about 2 months away from finishing their internal build out when all this started, and so I'm guessing it'll be about 2 months after things start up. I'm assuming construction will start end of May, beginning of June again. So we're talking most likely August. And then AMC was actually planning on opening March 30th. But of course their plans had to change based upon COVID-19. So whenever this opens up, hopefully AMC's in good financial state, but having one of their newest facilities ready to go and people ready to come back and see some of these movies, that'll be important. But they're very close to being done, and so they're only probably weeks away whenever kind of the COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders are lifted. Let's see some of the questions that I got during this. Why are the street workers working? I don't think it's an essential service unless an emergency. We still get, and there's lots of pollen, there's still a lot of things going on that, sweeping the streets is important. Dust does declare, there's still garbage in the streets, and that's some things that the street sweepers get. I'll be posting this ultimately sometime this weekend, but I'm shocked about the number of disposable face masks, disposable gloves that I've been seeing in the streets, on the sidewalks. This is one of the reasons why, the street sweepers are out there. And I understand that people aren't moving their cars as much for those people that are parked in the streets, but it's still important that they're out there for cleaning the way for the bikes that are out there, and, for pedestrians crossing the street, sidewalks, and all that. It's really helpful to get current information about the local restaurants that are available in the city. We noticed the Dish Dash had its sign up. Yeah, so there are a lot of restaurants that are still open in the city. And if you're following my Facebook feed, you see that I highlight a different one every day. And the restaurant owners love it. The people working there, to highlight what they're doing. They are essential services. Doing takeout, if you can do it, several days a week. They need your business quite a bit, and so it's really important that you're still frequenting them if you can. I've found a lot of good restaurants that I'd never been to before, all because of suggestions from people. If you have suggestions, and I have a full list on my Facebook page of where I've visited, and I'll be adding that to my website. But right now, it's important that you still visit them and still frequent them. Let's see what other questions I've got. Wow, lots of questions today. Hang on. Let's see. Are we planning on doing a slow street thing like Oakland and San Francisco? I've been talking to the city manager, and we're looking at conceivably coning off certain streets. The question is, we still need a certain number of cars to pass through. There's certain areas where there aren't sidewalks, and that would be, some of the big places that we're looking at. So city staff, Public Works is currently evaluating that. Also, whether or not we actually have enough cones to do that. So it's like a new major project, except we're not doing a major project. One of the places I'm hoping to look at is Tasman. And, the city manager and I had a discussion about that. And so city staff is looking at that, because there's not a full sidewalk between Fair Oaks and Lawrence from that area. That being said, when light rail was first put in, that was a decision made by council at that point not to take out all the trees, but leave, put sidewalks where we could, but leave trees in certain areas where there are no sidewalks. So there's actually a VTA project looking at that. So that it's been kicked off, but it's been kind of stalled for some time now. Of doing a road diet there so that we could actually add sidewalks in and make that more walkable. But coning off one of those lanes, making it walkable for people that can't walk through that area is really important. So we're looking at a few areas within the city as far as that's concerned. What are the plans for AMC? I read that they might declare bankruptcy. What would that mean for Sunnyvale? So definitely, I've read a few of those also. There's a lot of companies that are declaring bankruptcy. That being said, bankruptcy doesn't mean that the company ends. Look at the number of times Sears went through bankruptcy, all that. A lot of times it's for them to restructure, get rid of some of their debt, and then restart the company. AMC is committed to that location, and I would assume that from an operational standpoint, having the newest theater as opposed to some of their older theaters, having food delivery, all that, it's a full bar, it's a full restaurant delivered to your seat. I think that would attract a lot of people. So it being more of the niche sort of movie theater, I think, is important. Is the city going to help Silicon Valley Services, Sunnyvale Community Services financially? So since they can't help any more people in need, this should be a priority. So we already gave them a grant of $250,000, and and the city manager is monitoring their use of that grant. They haven't used all that money yet. And then conceivably, what I talked about previously was the additional $150,000 for nonprofit agencies within our city, doing servicing residents and businesses. That's another tranche of money that could conceivably, Sunnyvale Community Services could be applying for. Let's see. And also from that standpoint, I'm working at a regional level. There's Sacred Heart and, Silicon Valley Strong has collected a lot of money from the South Bay here, and they're basically giving that money to residents. And so, we had a certain percentage of the first 4,400 residents that applied and were approved through that program. So through the Sunnyvale, Silicon Valley Strong. And then I'm working with, I have a phone call later today to talk about, additional funds, because there was a fundraiser a few weekends ago that will also assist families throughout the Bay Area, throughout the South Bay. Let's see. Oh, and as far as restaurants are concerned, there is a city website, and I've sent that link every now and then of all the open restaurants. Call your favorite restaurant to see which ones are available. And some stores might have the right to deny entry to anyone wearing masks. I hate to be in stores around people that are not wearing masks. Just have stores deny entrance. So some stores, so each, business, each facility, can define what their procedures are. They have to basically come up with the procedures of how to handle customers during COVID-19. And depending upon the facility, they might decide to deny masks. I know Zanato's was creating their own masks. I reached out in the community, and we had 400 masks delivered to them yesterday, so they can hand out masks to people that are purchasing things in their store. If two people come in together, one has a mask and one doesn't, they're asking the person that doesn't have a mask not to come in. So, each different business, depending on how they operate. Some stores are basically like Phil's downtown, are only allowing people to come to the doorway, order, and they'll bring it to the doorway, so people aren't actually going into the stores. And so I've seen that from several restaurants also. So it depends on the procedures that are defined by a specific restaurant. But I agree, having everyone wear this mask in the restaurants and in the stores is critical, and I continue to work from a county level. If you think it's that way, definitely contact the county supervisors. The more they hear from residents who are asking for this, the better it is. I don't think having every city mandate it on its own makes sense. I'm hoping that the county will listen. So use your voice, call your county supervisors and give them that suggestion. So I think that's about it. We're a little over on time today. It's after 10. I want to thank you again for joining me this week. Please comment if you have questions that weren't asked, or if you see this video much later, please comment on this video. Send me email at council@larryklein.com if you have further questions or comments. If you want to get more involved, Sunnyvale is still taking board applications to our boards and commissions until next Thursday. So 5 p.m. next Thursday, April 30th, is the deadline for applications. I just want to, say that the pandemic puts all this into perspective. Helping out your neighbor, helping out other people. I've been delivering masks, and people are so appreciative. I'm really proud of our community response. Help each other however you can. Make masks, share masks. Mow your neighbor's lawn if they can't do it. Share homemade bread, cookies, whatever. Help out your neighbors. This builds our community. I'm really proud of Sunnyvale residents and how they've come together, how they've responded to this crisis that is bigger than anyone would have ever thought. Be safe this week. If you're out on a walk, wave, say hello to, from a safe social distance, say hello to your neighbor, to those who you pass in the street. Sunnyvale will emerge from this as a stronger community. We're in this together. We'll get through this together. So thanks for everyone for listening. And until next week, stay safe. Thank you very much. Have a good week. Take care.